Jeff Laurenti is with us via Skype from Trenton, New Jersey. He is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where his work focuses on international peace and the politics of American foreign policy. Jeff, it's always good to see you. Man, has the waters been muddied by these airstrikes. I think a lot of the conversation will be, what will the Assad regime do in response? If they react, then they're in a pickle. If they don't react, seems like they're in a pickle. What do you make of it?
It's a very deep dilemma for the Assad government, because it has had as its strongest nationalist credentials its unyielding confrontation with Israel, the demand that Israel has to withdraw from all Arab territories seized in 1967. But the failure to respond to a major Israeli airstrike, which the one that was done over the weekend, the second one, appears to have been. This goes beyond the initial attacks on weapons that seemed bound for Hezbollah in Lebanon. Presents, as you say, a major problem for Assad, because if he does not respond, he will look impotent. If he does respond, he is then escalating a conflict when his own forces are already depleted by the long civil war inside Syria. So his nationalist credentials, in a sense, are on the line here, and he cannot afford to look like a toothless lion, Assad being the Arabic word for lion.
Right. And on the aside, what do you make of the fact that Israel has not commented on these airstrikes, not really claimed responsibility yet?
Well, Israel is famous for withholding any credit for or blame for military actions it undertakes until it deems the time is right. But American intelligence, American authorities have no doubts that this was Israeli as opposed to Saudi or some other potentially interested anti-Assad strike. And the Israeli intentions have to be parsed out. If this goes beyond simply trying to interdict the flow of missiles to Hezbollah, are they trying to destabilize the Assad government? Are they trying to show the Assad regime that they can play inside Syrian politics in a way that could be dangerous, more dangerous for Assad? It's not clear what their intentions were with this latest strike.
Jeff, Julian Phillips here. Many say, experts, that the size and scope of these attacks have all the earmarks of the Israeli government on them. That being said, there's also something else that appeared in today's New York Times, where the United Nations human rights investigators say that perhaps, just perhaps, the Syrian rebels now also may have used sarin nerve gas. If that is the case, if that turns out to be true, how does that further muddy the waters here?
Well, Julian, you put your finger on something that has actually turned on its head what had been the kind of hawkish calls for U.S. intervention over the past couple of weeks, based on the supposition that it was the Syrian government that had used chemical weapons. And since President Obama had perhaps impulsively last summer said that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line that would trigger U.S. intervention, we've heard the calls from the hawkish side of the Washington aviary for now forceful measures to show that you're ready to put up when your bluff, lest your bluff be called. But the UN Commission has been investigating human rights abuses in Syria. Interestingly, not the new panel that has been set up to investigate chemical weapons use, which the Syrian government has not yet admitted into its territory, but the human rights investigators who are in the countries along the borders with Syria, interviewing refugees. The report that Reuters published over the weekend and that the New York Times ran in its editions today suggests that sarin gas has been used, but by some rebel group. Now remember, the rebels are not a centrally organized and commanded force. The rebels are a bunch of different militias, most of them now with increasingly Islamic zeal propelling them. Moderates don't tend to pick up guns and fight for 2 years. It's people who are true believers in something. And the possibility that it was rebels using them, in a sense, some say, take President Obama off the hook in terms of having to get into a military intervention in Syria that he plainly doesn't want to do, that he's been resisting, but that the traditional hawks in Washington, like Senator McCain, have been counseling for 2 years. Folks who don't see a single war that they don't want the United States to get involved in.
And this is, there's so many variables here in this growing conflict here. Someone suggests that the Israeli strikes, or alleged strikes against the Syrians, were against the elite Republican Guard and really did not affect Assad's assault on his own people. That being said, you also have an inner conflict here of the Shias and the Sunnis, which is played out all over this region. What is the end game for us here? How do we come out winners in this, if we can at all?
Well, the question is, what is our essential, that is our as Americans, essential responsibility as opposed to the larger global community? And it is hard to see how the United States comes out of a long, grinding conflict that is wearing down the Syrian state and inviting long-term disorder there with much to show for it. Some of the national security advocates of intervention will say that the biggest gain will be to get the Iranian alliance with Syria broken, that Iran has used Syria as a conduit to its allies in Lebanon, who keep putting pressure on the Israelis and provoking violence between Israelis and Lebanon. So that would be one presumed gain. But if you get an Islamic state, and many of the rebels openly tell even Western reporters that, of course, they're fighting for an Islamic state, that Assad has been a secular government that tolerated, in fact, gave political space for religious minorities, Christians, as well as the Alawite Shiite minority that dominates the military under Assad, that all this could come apart. Now, that's, I think that this speaks, in a sense, to your question about what Assad's own survival prospects are. And there's every reason to believe that within Syrian politics and Syrian fight, that this regime could hold its own over half of Syria for quite a long time. It does have a constituency. And the constituency is basically the non-Sunni believers in a Sunni Muslim state. And that's close to half of the population of Syria.
Yeah, I guess the question here, as that regard, is the fact that the civil war that's been going on for 2 years, is that a reflection of the resilience of the rebels or the persistence of the Assad regime? This depends on how you look at it.
Well, what it is exactly that, the resilience of both sides in Syria. Now, when Julian had mentioned the Israeli strikes appeared yesterday to be targeted against the Republican Guard, which is the elite force behind the regime and the most strongly committed. What's interesting is that Assad has not deployed the Republican Guards in the strife against the Syrian rebels. Those have been held back. Those remain intact. He's been using the regular army to fight this war against the rebels, against the insurgents. The Israelis, in allegedly striking Republican Guard facilities, appear to be sending a signal that they can do what the rebels can't, which is strike at the very core foundations of what would be, for Assad, his ultimate fallback if, in fact, he began to lose further ground. Remember, for the past 4 months, the Syrian government has not been losing ground. You've had almost no defections from its military for all of this year. So it appears to have stopped the erosion that had been eating away at it in the first year and a half. So the prospect of the Israelis being able to take blows at the core bedrock could well upset the balance internally and affect various parties' calculations. None of the rebels want us to be allied with the Israelis either, let's be clear, but they could be beneficiaries.
Jeff, there's been no formal response from the White House following these airstrikes. Is there a message to be heard from that silence?
Well, one message that you can infer from it is that the administration itself doesn't yet have a clear response of its own to either the question of chemical weapons or to the calls for an American intervention or a Western-led intervention that would finally pull the plug on the Assad government. And that being the case, best to first know what the facts are. As President Obama said last week, we want to be sure that we know what the the facts are regarding chemical weapons use at precisely the moment that you had the loudest baying for a quick American intervention. And now the report suggests that it could have been the other side, the so-called good guys who may have used it, or some faction among the rebels that might have used it. And it's reminiscent of the 1998 attack that President Clinton launched against a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, after the Osama bin Laden embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. At that point, based on fragmentary evidence, there was a suspicion that maybe there were high levels of toxic chemicals that you could use in chemical weapons in the vicinity of the plant. They didn't have everything nailed down, but in the zeal to rush to a response after that attack, they took out that pharmaceutical factory. In the end, it was proved fairly convincingly that there had been no chemical weapons activity or production at that site. And I think Obama is looking to avoid these kinds of impulsive actions with insufficient evidence, either a one-shot strike like that or the massive fraud that was perpetrated in terms of persuading people that Saddam Hussein had an arsenal that the United States had to invade to eliminate.
You know, and of course, Obama took a lot of heat, particularly from the opposing party, about not taking action and being so careful. It would seem that at least his caution has been vindicated with this latest UN report. I'm wondering if the White House is perhaps, at least behind the scenes, just a little bit happy about the Israeli airstrikes or alleged airstrikes, because doesn't that give us just a little bit of breathing room to kind of figure out what we want to do and how we want to be involved?
I think that certainly people have been waiting to exhale, as it were, with relief with this preliminary report from the head of the UN Human Rights Investigating Commission. With regard to the Israeli strike, I suspect that is more destabilizing from Washington's point of view. It could lead in any number of directions. The interventionist side of the American debate points to the success of the apparently Israeli airstrike as evidence that the concern of defense planners in the Pentagon and in Paris and London, that the Syrians had strong anti-air defenses that would take a very lethal toll of attackers, that's been proved in the view of the interventionists by the success of the Israeli strike not to be a consideration. So,
all right. Jeff Laurenti, thank you so much for your perspective and analysis. You have conducted a clinic here, and it's been very enlightening. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.